You're sitting in your car, or maybe just walking past it, thinking everything is completely normal. When suddenly, a legal shift you didn't even realize happened starts to affect how that moment is interpreted under the law. Not because you changed anything, not because your intent changed, but because the legal interpretation around firearms, permits, and vehicle possession has been evolving in ways most people never follow closely until it's too late. And here's the part most viewers never think about. What you believe is allowed and what the law actually considers compliant are not always the same thing, especially when Supreme Court interpretations begin to reshape long-standing assumptions about gun regulations in public spaces and vehicles. Now here's the question I want you to answer honestly in the comments. If laws around carrying firearms in vehicles changed in a way you didn't fully understand, do you believe the responsibility is more on the government to clearly communicate it or on citizens to stay constantly updated on legal shifts that affect daily life? I want you to answer that below. I'm genuinely curious where people stand on this. Now, to understand what's actually being discussed when people say gun permits are over or everything has changed, we need to slow this down and separate headlines from legal reality. Because in my legal analysis, the United States Supreme Court does not simply delete permit systems in a blanket way. What actually happens in most landmark rulings is far more precise. The court interprets constitutional boundaries, especially under the Second Amendment, and then lower courts and states adjust their regulatory systems around that interpretation. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms, but it has never existed in a vacuum without regulation. Over time, the court has repeatedly acknowledged that certain forms of licensing, background checks, and restrictions can be consistent with the Constitution, depending on how they are structured and applied. Historically, gun regulation in America has gone through several phases. In earlier eras, firearms laws were relatively limited, often varying widely by state and locality. But as urban environments expanded and public safety concerns evolved, states introduced more structured systems, especially around concealed carry permits and vehicle transport rules. That's where the legal complexity begins, because when firearms are kept inside a vehicle, courts often treat the situation differently than when they are carried openly in public. A vehicle can be viewed as a temporary extension of personal space in some legal contexts, but it is still subject to state-level regulation, traffic law enforcement authority, and in some cases, search and seizure protections under the Fourth Amendment. And that's important. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, which means law enforcement generally needs probable cause or a lawful exception to search a vehicle. However, firearm visibility, lawful traffic stops, and state-specific transport laws can significantly change how those protections are applied in practice. The Fifth Amendment also becomes relevant in certain scenarios, particularly around due process. If a state imposes penalties for firearm possession in a vehicle, courts would likely examine whether individuals had fair notice of the law and whether enforcement is consistent and non-arbitrary. Now, when people hear about Supreme Court emergency rulings or sweeping changes, it's important to understand how rare and specific those actually are. The court typically issues decisions that clarify constitutional standards, not sudden nationwide abolitions of entire permitting systems. In recent decades, Supreme Court precedent has increasingly focused on strengthening individual gun rights under the Second Amendment, while still allowing certain regulatory frameworks. That balance is where most legal disputes currently exist, between broad constitutional rights and state-level regulatory authority. From a real-world perspective, the impact of any shift in interpretation is rarely immediate chaos or instant elimination of permits. Instead, what usually happens is more subtle, but far more important. States begin revising their statutes, courts reinterpret enforcement standards, and law enforcement agencies adjust training and policy guidance over time. For lawful gun owners, this creates a critical issue. Compliance is no longer just about knowing the general rule. It's about understanding how that rule is being interpreted in your specific jurisdiction at that specific time. And here is where legal risk quietly increases. Because even if someone believes they are acting within their rights, misunderstandings about transport rules, storage requirements, or permit recognition between states can lead to serious legal consequences. Not necessarily because of intent, but because firearm law is highly technical and extremely jurisdiction-dependent. Politically, the reality is also far more complex than viral headlines suggest. Major changes to gun laws face significant legislative resistance, judicial scrutiny, and procedural hurdles. Even when courts shift interpretations, implementation still depends heavily on state compliance and administrative enforcement. Supporters of broader gun rights often argue that permitting systems can become overly restrictive or inconsistently applied, effectively limiting constitutional rights in practice. On the other side, supporters of structured regulation argue that permits help ensure public safety, accountability, and traceability without eliminating lawful ownership. Both arguments have constitutional relevance, and courts have historically acknowledged elements of both positions in different rulings. Long term, the real question is not whether gun permits exist or disappear overnight, but how the legal framework continues to evolve in defining the balance between individual rights and regulatory authority. And that evolution is not just legal, it is practical, affecting how people store, transport, and interact with firearms in everyday life. This is why understanding the law is not optional knowledge for gun owners. It is essential, because enforcement does not operate on headlines. It operates on statutes, interpretations, and jurisdictional details that can change over time. Before anything else, this is exactly why informed discussion matters more than reaction. What most people miss in discussions like this is that Supreme Court rulings rarely function like a switch that flips laws on or off overnight. In reality, they operate more like a lens change. Courts across the country begin interpreting older laws through a new constitutional standard. To understand this clearly, we need to look at how modern Second Amendment doctrine has evolved. In landmark decisions such as District of Columbia versus Heller and later cases like New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the Supreme Court reinforced that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess firearms, particularly for lawful purposes like self-defense. But in my legal analysis, what is equally important is what the court did not do. It did not eliminate all forms of regulation. Instead, it shifted the standard courts must use when evaluating gun laws. Under the Bruin framework, regulations must be consistent with the historical tradition of firearm regulation in the United States. That single shift has had massive implications for how lower courts evaluate licensing systems, including permits related to concealed carry and, in some jurisdictions, transportation rules involving vehicles. Now, when people hear phrases like gun permits are over, what is usually being referenced is not a literal nationwide repeal. It is often a reaction to court decisions that have limited how restrictive states can make permit systems, especially when those systems are considered overly discretionary or difficult to obtain. But there is a critical distinction here. Even after these rulings, states still retain significant authority under the 10th Amendment to regulate firearms within their borders, as long as those regulations do not violate the constitutional standards set by the Supreme Court. This is where federal versus state legal structure becomes extremely important. The federal government sets broad constitutional boundaries. States implement detailed regulatory frameworks within those boundaries. That means two people in two different states can face very different legal requirements regarding the exact same act of carrying or transporting a firearm in a vehicle. Now let's talk about the real-world impact. For lawful gun owners, the most significant effect is uncertainty during transition periods after major court rulings. Law enforcement agencies must update training, legislatures may revise statutes, and courts may temporarily issue conflicting interpretations until a consistent standard is fully established. During these periods, legal risk does not come from exercising rights in bad faith. It often comes from misunderstanding updated procedural requirements. For example, something as simple as how a firearm is stored in a vehicle, whether it is loaded or unloaded, or whether it is visible or secured in a case, can change the legal classification of the situation depending on the jurisdiction. And this is where Fourth Amendment considerations become practically relevant again. During lawful traffic stops, courts have generally allowed certain limited searches of vehicles under established exceptions. However, firearm presence can escalate the legal scrutiny of the situation, even when the firearm is lawfully possessed. That does not remove rights, but it does increase the importance of procedural compliance. Fifth Amendment due process concerns also appear when laws are inconsistently enforced or when individuals are penalized under unclear or recently changed interpretations. Courts would likely examine whether an ordinary person had reasonable notice of the legal requirements at the time of the incident. Now, stepping back from technical law, we also need to address political reality. Even when Supreme Court decisions shift constitutional interpretation, legislative responses often take years to fully develop. Some states move quickly to align laws with new rulings, others enter extended legal challenges that can result in further appellate litigation. So, in practical terms, the legal landscape around firearms in vehicles and permit systems is not static. It is actively evolving. And that evolution creates a responsibility for lawful gun owners that is often underestimated. Staying informed not through headlines, but through actual legal updates in their jurisdiction. Supporters of strong Second Amendment protections argue that overly complex permitting systems can function as indirect barriers to constitutional rights. They emphasize simplicity, consistency, and accessibility as core principles. On the other hand, supporters of structured regulation argue that permits and controlled systems help reduce misuse, improve accountability, and create standardized safety expectations across communities. Both perspectives continue to shape legislative debates and judicial reasoning, and neither has fully dominated the legal landscape. Looking forward, the most likely scenario is not the complete disappearance of permits nationwide, but rather continued fragmentation, some states expanding constitutional carry frameworks, others maintaining structured licensing systems refined to meet constitutional scrutiny. Now let's bring this back to the real takeaway. The most important issue is not political rhetoric or viral headlines. It is legal awareness, because when laws change, even subtly, the consequences are real. And in areas involving firearms, those consequences can escalate quickly if someone relies on outdated assumptions rather than current legal standards. This is why education matters more than reaction. Because the law does not operate based on what people think it should be. It operates based on how courts interpret constitutional limits and how states implement those interpretations in practice. And no matter where you stand politically, one fact remains consistent. Understanding the law is not optional when it directly affects your rights, your responsibilities, and your daily life. If there is one final thought to leave you with, it is this. Constitutional rights are not just about possession, they are about responsibility, awareness, and lawful conduct within a constantly evolving legal system. And in moments like this, where interpretation and policy are actively shifting, the most powerful position anyone can take is not assumption, but informed understanding. Now I want to end with this question for you. Do you believe firearm laws should be interpreted more uniformly across all states under one clear national standard, or should states continue having flexibility to define their own regulatory systems within constitutional limits? Share your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to see how different perspectives view this balance. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure you stay subscribed, because these legal shifts are not slowing down anytime soon. And understanding them early is always the advantage. Stay informed, stay aware, and most importantly, stay legally responsible in everything you do.